The tray held more food than he had seen in weeks. Meat sat beside potatoes in quantities beyond belief. He lifted the fork slowly, uncertain if this was real. Subscribe to join us each week for more quiet history. The metal tray felt warm against his calloused palms. Steam rose from mashed potatoes piled high and smooth. A piece of roasted chicken rested beside green beans. White bread, actual white bread, sat wrapped in paper. Coffee filled a cup, its aroma rich and unexpected. He had crossed an ocean as a prisoner of a distant war. Now he sat in a mess hall somewhere in rural America. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead as always. Other prisoners moved through the serving line in silence. Each man received the same abundant portions without fail. For generations before the war, German families knew thrift. Meals meant careful planning and using every scrap of food. Bread formed the foundation of most working-class tables. Potatoes appeared at breakfast, lunch, and dinner too. Meat remained a luxury saved for Sunday meals and holidays. His mother had stretched one chicken across 3 full days. Broth from bones became soup that fed the family twice. Vegetable gardens behind narrow houses provided what they could. Nothing went to waste in households where money stayed tight. This careful economy defined how millions of families ate. The first years of war had only tightened those old habits. Ration cards determined who received what food and when now. Lines formed early at shops with less to offer each month. Butter became a memory replaced by margarine or nothing. Coffee vanished and substitutes tasted of roasted grain instead. His unit had marched on black bread and thin vegetable stews. Field kitchens served meals that barely filled a soldier's gut. Hunger became as constant as the cold and the exhaustion. By the final months, even officers ate sparingly every day. He had learned to ignore the hollow feeling in his stomach. The American soldier serving food never asked his name or rank. He simply placed each item on the tray with practiced speed. No one weighed the portions or checked against a daily limit. The abundance seemed careless, almost wasteful to trained eyes. Yet every prisoner received exactly the same generous amount. This represented something deeper than simple American plenty. The United States had never felt blockade starve its cities. Farms across vast plains produced more grain than markets needed. Cattle ranches stretched across states larger than entire nations. Industrial food processing had transformed American eating habits. Canned goods filled shelves in quantities unimaginable elsewhere. Refrigeration meant fresh meat reached tables far from farms. Bread came sliced and wrapped in paper from distant bakeries. Most American families in these years ate meat almost daily. Abundance had become ordinary, expected, barely even noticed. He remembered the Geneva Convention articles read at capture. Prisoners were to receive rations equal to the captor's troops. At the time, those words had meant little to exhausted men. Now the treaty's promise sat steaming on a metal tray before. Americans were simply following rules their nation had signed, but understanding the policy did not diminish the deep shock. His hands moved slowly, selecting which item to taste first. The mashed potatoes felt smooth and buttery on his tongue. Real butter, not the substitutes he had known for years. Salt and pepper sat in small shakers on each table freely. He could season his food however much he wanted without limit. Other prisoners ate with similar, careful, almost reverent focus. Some men wept quietly, overcome by this unexpected abundance. Others ate quickly, as if afraid the food might disappear. A few saved bread in their pockets from old habits of want. Guards watched but said nothing about the hoarded food portions. They had seen this reaction from other captured men before. The bread felt impossibly soft between his work-worn fingers. American white bread bore no resemblance to dense German loaves. It compressed easily under gentle pressure, then sprang back up. The crust barely existed, nothing like the hard shells back home. He spread butter thickly, watching it melt into the warm bread. Such simple pleasure had become foreign after years of deprivation. For generations before mechanization changed everything forever, bread had meant labor. Grain required planting, tending, harvesting with back-breaking effort. Mills ground flour through processes refined over countless centuries. Bakers shaped loaves before dawn, so families had fresh bread daily. Every slice represented hours of human work across many hands. The war had only made this ancient labor more precious and scarce. In Germany, during these final hungry years, bread rations dropped. Official allowances could not mask the reality of failing supply. Sawdust mixed into flour stretched diminishing stocks a bit further. The heavy loaves sustained life but brought little satisfaction. Women queued for hours, hoping shops had not run empty already. Children learned to eat slowly, making small portions last longer. Meanwhile, American bakeries produced mountains of soft white loaves. Trucks delivered bread to stores daily in quantities beyond need. Families often threw away bread that had gone slightly stale. What seemed wasteful to starving Europeans appeared normal to Americans. The contrast revealed different worlds shaped by different histories. He sipped the coffee and felt warmth spread through his chest. Real coffee, not the grain-based substitutes that mocked the name. Der bitterness tasted familiar, yet strange after so long without. Sugar sat in a bowl nearby, available without any restrictions. He added 2 spoonfuls, then a third, testing this new reality. The chicken pulled apart easily under his fork's gentle pressure. Juices ran clear, the meat cooked through and seasoned well. His stomach, shrunken from months of inadequate rations, protested. Eating this much after such deprivation required slow, careful pacing. Guards had warned them about eating too quickly at first meal. Some men became sick from overwhelming their deprived digestive systems. Green beans sat in butter that glistened under the harsh lights. Vegetables had become scarce back home as armies requisitioned everything. Gardens could not produce enough to feed both soldiers and civilians. Transport breakdowns meant fresh produce rotted before reaching cities far. These beans, canned but plentiful, seemed impossibly green and fresh. The meal continued in near silence, broken only by quiet sounds. Forks scraped plates as men ate with focused concentration always. Some prisoners exchanged glances that communicated wordless shared astonishment. Others kept their eyes down, perhaps ashamed of their visible relief. The guards maintained their distance, giving the men privacy to process. This was not the first group of German prisoners these Americans fed. Camps across the United States held hundreds of thousands by now. Most installations followed the same protocols and served similar abundant meals. The reaction remained consistent: shock, disbelief, confusion, and sometimes anger. How could a nation provide such abundance to captured enemy soldiers? For generations, military culture had taught different lessons about captives everywhere. Prisoners represented burdens, mouths to feed when supplies stayed limited always. Harsh treatment served as both punishment and practical resource management together. The idea of feeding enemies as well as one's own troops seemed wasteful. Yet American abundance allowed for this approach without real hardship at home. The German soldier had heard propaganda about American weakness and decadence. Soft people who loved comfort more than honor or sacrifice, supposedly. A nation of mixed peoples without true unity or warrior spirit. Yet these supposedly weak Americans had crossed an ocean and kept fighting. Their supply lines never faltered, their equipment never ran short either. The abundant food portions spoke to something beyond simple military logistics. This was a demonstration of industrial capacity and agricultural might combined. America could feed both its own population and captured enemies without strain. The message came through clearly without anyone speaking it aloud. Absolute victory. Germany's hunger revealed defeat more clearly than any battle loss ever could. He finished the chicken and felt fuller than he had in months. Half the potatoes remained on his plate, an impossible surplus before. Other prisoners also left food, their stomachs unable to handle more. Guards collected trays and assured men there would be dinner later. More food would come reliably every single day without fail promised. The barracks where they slept had bunks with actual mattresses and blankets. Each man received sheets, pillowcases, and a towel for personal washing. Showers provided hot water, soap, and privacy unimaginable in field conditions. The camp library held books, in German for prisoners to read, freely. All of this confused men who expected harsh treatment as captives. For generations before these modern wars changed everything about conflict forever, prisoners faced brutal conditions. Dungeons held captives in darkness with minimal food or water provided. Ransom determined whether a prisoner lived or died in past centuries. Labor camps worked prisoners until bodies gave out under brutal strain. The Geneva Conventions represented recent attempts to civilize warfare's worst aspects, yet enforcement remained inconsistent across different nations and different fronts always. German camps in the East operated under far different rules entirely. Soviet prisoners in German hands faced starvation, exposure, and mass death. The Eastern Front had descended into total war without mercy shown. Western prisoners generally fared better under international observation and agreements. American treatment of German prisoners followed established protocols strictly enforced. Inspectors from neutral nations visited camps and documented conditions regularly observed. Violations brought swift correction and sometimes prosecution of responsible officers. The United States sought to demonstrate its commitment to civilized warfare. This approach served propaganda purposes as well as humanitarian goals together. The German soldier lay on his bunk that night, unable to sleep. His stomach felt heavy, unaccustomed to such quantity of food inside. He thought about his family back home, wondering what they ate. Letters took weeks to arrive and told little of real conditions. His mother's last letter had mentioned standing in a long bread line. She had written cheerfully about spring planting in the garden plot. Between the lines he read hunger, worry, and growing hopelessness clearly. The city where his family lived had been bombed repeatedly by now. Food supplies grew scarcer as transportation infrastructure took more damage daily. He wondered if they had eaten anything today comparable to his dinner. The guilt sat heavy in his chest alongside the unfamiliar fullness. He was a prisoner eating better than his own mother back home. The war had created these strange inversions of expected order everywhere. Soldiers fed while civilians starved, enemies treated well, while allies suffered. Nothing made sense anymore in this world, turned upside down completely. For generations, military honor had meant protecting women, children, and homeland always. Soldiers endured hardships so that families at home could live safely. Sacrifice made sense when it shielded loved ones from war's worst horrors. But total war had erased those old distinctions between soldier and civilian. Bombers struck cities, submarines sank merchant ships, and everyone became a target. His own bombing missions had targeted factories where civilians also worked. Orders had described military targets, but bombs fell imprecisely always. He had seen smoke rising from residential areas near industrial complexes. The raids were meant to break the enemy's will and capacity together. Now he understood what those raids had meant from the receiving end. American bombers had visited German cities with increasing frequency and tonnage. Each raid destroyed not just factories but also shops, homes, and lives. Food distribution centers burned, railway stations collapsed, warehouses exploded in flames. The hunger he had escaped by, being captured, continued back home unabated. His presence here meant one less mouth, demanding scarce resources there perhaps. The other prisoners seemed to be processing similar thoughts in the darkness. Quiet conversations in German drifted between bunks as men shared confusions. Some argued this treatment proved Americans were indeed soft and sentimental. Others suggested it demonstrated strength rather than weakness. They could afford generosity. A few remained silent, lost in private thoughts too painful to share. Morning brought breakfast as substantial as dinner had been the night before. Oatmeal, milk, sugar, bread, butter, jam, and coffee appeared in abundance. Some prisoners had dreamed this was temporary, a single merciful meal only. The reality of continued plenty brought new waves of psychological adjustment. They would have to accept that this abundance was real and ongoing. For generations before industrial agriculture transformed American farming completely, abundance remained uncertain. Pioneer families had known hunger during harsh winters and drought years. Preserving food required constant labor to prevent spoilage and waste always. Root cellars held vegetables through cold months when nothing else grew. Abundance was seasonal, temporary, something to be celebrated but not expected. The transformation had come through mechanization, scale, and systematic organization together. Tractors replaced horses and oxen, multiplying what one farmer could manage. Hybrid seeds produced yields that would have seemed impossible to earlier farmers. Chemical fertilizers pushed productivity beyond what natural processes alone could achieve. Railways and trucks moved harvests from productive regions to consuming populations far. By the time war came, American agriculture fed the nation with surplus. Exports went to allied nations while domestic tables remained abundantly supplied. Rationing existed but remained minimal compared to deprivations elsewhere in the world. Butter might be scarce, but meat stayed available. Bread never truly disappeared. The war strained American abundance but never broke its fundamental productive capacity. The German prisoners worked in the camp under supervised but humane conditions. Some tended vegetable gardens that supplemented the mess hall's ample supplies. Others performed maintenance, painting, repairs, and general labor as assigned. The work was light compared to military service or factory labor back home. They received small wages they could use at the camp canteen weekly. The canteen sold cigarettes, candy, soap, and other comfort items for purchase. Prices stayed low, and most prisoners could afford small luxuries regularly now. American cigarettes tasted different from German tobacco but remained satisfying nonetheless. Chocolate bars, real chocolate, sat in boxes available to anyone with money. These small pleasures felt surreal to men who had known deprivation so long. For generations, chocolate had meant celebration and special occasions for most families. Cacao came from distant tropical regions. and required complex processing before use. The finished product remained expensive, reserved for holidays and important life moments. Children received chocolate rarely, making each piece a treasured memory long remembered. Soldiers sometimes carried chocolate as a morale boost and quick energy during combat. American industry had made chocolate commonplace through mass production and efficiency. Candy factories produced millions of bars that shipped to stores nationwide always. Hershey's had contracted to supply the military with specially formulated ration bars. The same industrial capacity that built tanks also churned out sweet treats. This ability to produce both weapons and luxuries simultaneously demonstrated total economic power. The prisoner ate a chocolate bar slowly, letting each piece melt completely. Sweetness flooded his mouth, triggering memories of childhood birthday celebrations long ago. His mother had saved for weeks to buy chocolate for his 8th birthday. That single bar had been shared among 5 family members in small pieces. Now he ate an entire bar himself, alone, as a captured enemy prisoner. Letters from home arrived irregularly, censored by both German and American authorities. His mother wrote that she was well, the garden was growing, everything was fine. The forced cheerfulness could not disguise the truth between the carefully chosen words. His younger brother had been conscripted into the Volkssturm Home Defense Forces now. 15-year-old boys now carried rifles to defend a Reich already lost clearly. He wrote back describing the camp without mentioning the food portions specifically. Censors might remove such details, or his family might not believe them anyway. How could he explain eating meat daily when they struggled to find bread? The guilt of survival mixed with relief that he at least was safe. His war had ended early while the nightmare continued for everyone else. For generations, soldiers had returned home carrying stories of what they had witnessed. Veterans spoke of foreign lands, strange customs, and different ways of living. These accounts shaped how communities understood the wider world beyond their borders. But prisoners carried a different kind of knowledge, marked by reversal and dependence. They had seen enemy societies from positions of forced vulnerability and observation. The prisoner began to notice details about American culture through small interactions. Guards spoke casually about weekend plans, movies, and girlfriends back home waiting. They complained about the camp's isolation and expressed hope for reassignment elsewhere. War for them seemed like a job, unpleasant but temporary and bounded. The ideological fervor that had driven his own service seemed absent here. American newspapers available in the camp showed advertisements for products beyond counting. Cars, refrigerators, washing machines, and countless other manufactured goods for sale. Even during wartime, civilian consumption continued at levels unimaginable in Germany now. Factories produced both weapons and consumer goods simultaneously without apparent strain showing. The American economy operated on a scale that defied comparison to European standards. He began to understand that his nation had challenged an opponent beyond its weight. Germany's industrial base, impressive by European standards, seemed small against American capacity. The hunger he felt, the shortages everywhere, reflected a fundamental imbalance of resources. Will and courage could not overcome such disparities in productive power ultimately. The war had been lost before the first shot fired, though no one knew. For generations, European powers had dominated global affairs through colonial empires and industry. Germany had sought its place among these powers through territorial expansion and militarism. The United States had seemed distant, isolationist, and less relevant to European politics. American entry into both world wars had proven decisive both times, however clearly. The prisoner realized his generation had witnessed a fundamental shift in global power. Days became weeks, and weeks stretched into months of comfortable captivity's strange rhythm. The abundant food continued without interruption, 3 substantial meals arriving every day. His body recovered from the deprivations of combat and the final desperate months. Weight returned to his frame, color to his face, and strength to his limbs. Other prisoners experienced similar physical restoration under the steady diet's healing effects. Some men struggled with the psychological weight of their improved circumstances more deeply. Depression settled on those who thought constantly of families suffering back home. Others embraced the respite and tried to enjoy the relative peace offered here. A few grew angry at the contrast between their treatment and imagined civilian suffering. The camp's chaplain counseled men struggling to reconcile guilt with gratitude for survival. For generations, religious traditions had provided frameworks for understanding suffering and fortune's reversals. Prayers thanked God for daily bread and asked for mercy on those in need. The prisoner had attended church as a child, but war had tested faith severely. Now he found himself returning to chapel services seeking answers to impossible questions. Why had he survived when so many others died in the fighting's final chaos? The chaplain, an American officer, spoke decent German and listened without judging silently. He acknowledged that there were no easy answers to such questions about fate. Gratitude for survival need not erase concern for those still suffering back home. Perhaps surviving carried an obligation to eventually help rebuild what war destroyed. These conversations offered small comfort, but no resolution to the prisoners' conflicted feelings. News of Germany's surrender reached the camp through official announcements and newspaper reports. The war in Europe had ended, though fighting continued in the Pacific Theater. Prisoners received the news with mixed emotions, ranging from relief to deeper despair. Some wept for the defeated nation they had fought to defend unsuccessfully. Others felt secretly glad the killing had finally stopped after so many years. For generations, military culture had taught that honor meant fighting until victory was achieved. Surrender represented failure, disgrace, and betrayal of fallen comrades' ultimate sacrifices made. Yet continuing a lost war only multiplied suffering without changing the inevitable outcome. The prisoner felt relief that his younger brother might now survive after all. Germany's defeat meant his family would not starve through another winter of siege. The months after surrender brought uncertainty about what would happen to prisoners now. Repatriation would eventually occur, but the process would take time to organize fully. Germany lay occupied and divided, its cities ruined, its people displaced and starving. Returning to that devastation seemed almost more frightening than remaining in American captivity. At least here the food kept coming, the barracks stayed warm always. American guards mentioned something called the Marshall Plan being discussed in newspapers now. The United States was apparently considering massive aid to help rebuild Europe eventually. Former enemies might receive assistance rather than punishment under this unprecedented proposal unfolding. The prisoner struggled to understand this approach to defeated foes after total war. Every historical example he knew suggested victors extracted revenge, reparations, and punishment. For generations, defeated nations had paid tribute to victors as spoils of war. Populations faced harsh occupation, seizure of resources, and sometimes worse fate still. The Treaty of Versailles had imposed crushing terms on Germany after the First War. Those humiliations had festered and contributed to conditions enabling new conflict to emerge. Perhaps Americans sought to avoid repeating history's cycles of vengeance and renewed war. The prisoner thought about the food portions that had shocked him months earlier. That abundance had represented more than simple compliance with Geneva Convention rules truly. It demonstrated a fundamental truth about American power and potential generosity both together. A nation that could feed enemies well could also help rebuild after destroying utterly. The contrast between American capacity and European exhaustion had never seemed more stark. He wondered what Germany would become in this new post-war world now emerging. Cities lay in ruins, industries destroyed, infrastructure shattered beyond quick repair possible, millions displaced, families separated, women widowed, children orphaned by the war's destruction. Hunger stalked the defeated population more severely than even during the fighting's worst. Yet somewhere in distant American government offices, plans existed to address these crises. For generations, wars had ended with winners taking what they could from losers. The strong dominated the weak, extracted wealth, and imposed their will without mercy. This pattern had repeated throughout history, with numbing consistency across all cultures worldwide. The idea of victors helping rebuild defeated enemies seemed to violate fundamental rules. Yet perhaps those old rules had led only to cycles of conflict repeating endlessly. The prisoner began taking English lessons offered by the camp's education program available. Learning the language of his captors seemed practical regardless of what future held. American culture, American power, American influence would shape the coming world order clearly. Understanding these people meant more than knowing their language or customs only, though. It meant grappling with a fundamentally different worldview from his own European assumptions. Americans seemed to believe in abundance as a solvable problem through proper organization. Scarcity resulted from failure to apply sufficient resources and ingenuity to challenges. European culture had accepted limitations as natural, permanent features of existence itself. This fundamental difference in outlook explained much about the war's conduct and outcome. One side assumed abundance was possible while the other fought over perceived scarcities. The chocolate bars, the generous food portions, the casual waste all reflected this worldview. When resources seemed infinite, sharing became easier and generosity cost less to practice. The prisoner began to see his captivity as an education in alternative possibilities. Perhaps the post-war world would be shaped by this American vision of managed abundance. Europe would have to adapt to new realities or remain mired in old patterns. For generations, European intellectuals had viewed America as culturally inferior and provincial somehow, a nation of materialists without depth, philosophy, or true artistic achievement worth mentioning. The prisoner had absorbed these prejudices without questioning their validity or truth carefully. Now he recognized them as defensive reactions to America's growing power and influence worldwide. Cultural superiority had been claimed by those lacking material power to match their pride. He received word that repatriation would begin soon for certain prisoner categories first. Those with families in stable locations would be released to return home before others. The prisoner's family remained in the Western occupation zone under American military control currently. This meant he would likely see them within a few months if processes moved steadily. The prospect filled him with equal parts anticipation, anxiety, and deep uncertainty about everything. What would he find upon returning to a defeated, occupied, devastated German homeland? How had his family survived the final weeks of fighting and the immediate aftermath? Would his mother recognize him after the months and the changes war had wrought? Could his brother still be alive after being thrown into the desperate final defenses? These questions haunted him as departure approached and became increasingly concrete and real. For generations, soldiers had returned home to celebrations, honors, and grateful communities welcoming them. Veterans held respected places. In societies that valued martial service and sacrifice highly, but this time, soldiers would return to a nation that had lost everything completely. There would be no celebrations, no honors, only shared hunger and rubble and shame. They had failed to achieve victory, failed to protect homeland, failed at everything attempted. The prisoner packed his few belongings into a small bag provided for travel. He had gained weight. His uniform no longer fit as it had months ago. American authorities issued civilian clothes for the journey home across the ocean again. The same route he had traveled as a captured soldier, he would retrace as released. Everything had changed, yet nothing was resolved, only ended without clear resolution or meaning. A final meal in the mess hall carried symbolic weight he had not anticipated. The same abundant portions appeared on his tray one last time before departure tomorrow. He ate slowly, trying to memorize the sensation of fullness and security together. This might be his last adequate meal for a long time upon returning home. The future held uncertainty at best, hunger and hardship at worst, reconstruction always. For generations, abundance and scarcity had been understood as natural states beyond control. Good harvests and poor harvests, plenty and want, simply reflected fortune's wheel turning. His American captivity had demonstrated that abundance could be deliberately created and sustained. Industrial capacity, organizational systems, and agricultural science together transformed what was possible truly. The question was whether this knowledge could travel back with him across the ocean. He thought about the gardens he had tended in the camp during months of captivity. Seeds planted, watered, weeded, and harvested under the guards' casual supervision throughout seasons. The produce had supplemented the already ample food supplies unnecessarily but beneficially regardless. Growing food represented agency, connection to land, and productive work beyond mere detention. Perhaps gardens could be part of rebuilding efforts back home as well. Eventually, small practical knowledge gained here might prove more valuable than grand theories or plans. Composting techniques, crop rotation, efficient irrigation methods learned through hands-on camp work here. American Agricultural Extension. Pamphlets had been available in the camp library to study freely. Information about soil management, pest control, and maximizing yields from limited space carefully given. This knowledge belonged to no one nation but rather to all who chose to learn. For generations, agricultural knowledge had passed from parent to child through observation and practice. Traditional methods had evolved slowly over centuries to suit local conditions and available resources. Modern scientific agriculture offered dramatic improvements, but required new learning and adaptation always. The prisoner had absorbed some of these lessons almost accidentally during his captivity's months. Now he considered how to apply them in Germany's devastated landscape upon his return soon. The transport ship waited in port to carry prisoners back across the Atlantic Ocean. Hundreds of men lined up with their small bags and uncertain futures ahead waiting. American military police processed paperwork efficiently, checking names against master lists held carefully. No one spoke much as the line moved forward toward the waiting ship slowly. Each man carried private thoughts about what awaited on the far side of water. The ship's hold had been converted into basic transport accommodations for prisoners returning. Bunks lined the walls in rows, providing minimal but adequate sleeping space for everyone. Meals would be provided during the voyage, though presumably simpler than camp food portions. The prisoner found his assigned bunk and stored his bag in the small space. Around him, other men settled in with quiet efficiency born of long military experience. For generations, ocean crossings had, represented major life transitions between old worlds and new. Immigrants had traveled west seeking opportunity, while soldiers traveled east toward war and fighting. The prisoner had crossed as a young man full of propaganda and false confidence. Now he returned older, wiser, and deeply uncertain about what came next for everyone. The journey would take weeks, time enough to contemplate everything that had changed completely. The ship departed port as evening fell over the American coastline, slowly fading away. Prisoners lined the rails, watching land disappear into distance and gathering darkness beyond. Some wept quietly, others stared in silence at the vanishing continent behind them now. The prisoner felt no strong emotion, only a quiet exhaustion that ran bone deep. He had survived when millions had not, and now must discover what survival meant. The voyage passed in a strange, suspended state between two worlds and two realities. Not quite prisoner anymore, but not yet truly free in any meaningful sense either. The ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, offering no answers to persistent questions. Meals came twice daily, adequate but plain, reminding him of transitions underway now. Fellow passengers remained largely silent, each man lost in private thoughts and memories. For generations, soldiers had sung songs during marches to maintain morale and rhythm together. But this ship carried no songs, only silence broken by waves against hull. There seemed nothing to sing about, no victories to celebrate, no shared joy remaining. They were returning to a nation destroyed, occupied and uncertain about its future completely. Songs belonged to hope, and hope remained in short supply among these weary travelers. The prisoner spent hours on deck watching endless water move beneath empty sky above. Gulls had disappeared after the first days, leaving only ocean birds rarely seen flying. The vastness reminded him of how small individual lives appeared against history's large movements. He had been swept up in forces beyond his control or understanding then. Now he floated between past and future, neither place offering security or certainty truly. He thought about the American guards who had supervised him with professional detachment mostly. They had never been cruel, but neither had they been particularly friendly or personal. The prisoner had remained an abstraction to them, enemy, captive, responsibility, but not person. Yet they had fed him well, provided adequate shelter, and followed rules faithfully always. This impersonal fairness had its own dignity despite lacking warmth or genuine human connection. For generations, personal relationships had meant everything in European culture and society throughout. Family, village, regiment, nation. These bonds defined identity and obligation completely and absolutely. Americans seemed more individualistic, less bound by tradition's thick networks of mutual obligation forever. The prisoner had observed this difference without fully understanding its implications for society overall. Perhaps this explained American mobility, optimism, and belief in personal reinvention as possible choices. Land appeared finally on the horizon after weeks of empty ocean and sky only. Europe lay ahead, though what remained of Europe remained unclear from this distance yet. The ship would dock in a British port before prisoners transferred to trains heading eastward. German territory lay divided into occupation zones managed by different Allied powers now controlling. His destination was the American zone, where his family's last known address still lay. The prisoner gathered his few possessions and prepared for disembarkation from the ship finally. Other men moved through the same rituals with practiced efficiency and minimal conversation still. They had shared this journey without truly connecting or forming bonds worth mentioning later. Each man faced his own return, his own losses, his own uncertain future separately. The war had isolated them even from each other in fundamental ways that persisted. For generations, veterans had formed associations to maintain connections forged in combat shared together. Comradeship had been praised as the war's one redeeming feature by those who survived. But this defeat had poisoned even those traditional bonds of mutual support and understanding. Shame mixed with survival created toxic combinations that pushed men apart rather than together. The prisoner suspected he would rarely speak of these years to anyone upon returning. British military police directed prisoners onto trains waiting at the port station nearby. The journey east toward Germany would take days through lands also bearing war's scars. France had been fought over twice in one generation, leaving deep wounds everywhere visible. The trains moved slowly through landscapes marked by destruction, makeshift repairs, and deprivation. Everything looked tired, worn, used beyond capacity, and barely functioning anymore at all. The prisoner watched through windows as countryside passed, slowly revealing war's persistent marks. Bombed bridges had been temporarily replaced with Bailey structures built for immediate function. Villages showed gaps where buildings had stood before bombs or shells destroyed them utterly. People in fields worked with hand, tools, lacking fuel for machines or animals to pull. The whole continent seemed exhausted, bled dry by years of total war without mercy. For generations, Europe had been the world's industrial and cultural heartland, without question or rival. Empires had reached around the globe, carrying European power, trade, and ideas to everywhere. Now that world lay in ruins, dependent on American aid for basic survival needs. The prisoner recognized this shift as permanent, rather than temporary circumstance to be reversed. Europe's time of dominance had ended, and his generation witnessed this historical transformation firsthand. The train crossed into Germany, and the devastation intensified beyond what had come before. Cities appeared as moonscapes of rubble with survivors living in basement shelters beneath ruins. Railway stations stood roofless, walls pockmarked with bullet holes and shrapnel scars everywhere visible. Bridges had been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times, their patchwork construction revealing layers. This was the Germany he had fought to defend, now reduced to ash and stone. People visible from the train looked gaunt, wearing patched clothing and wooden-soled shoes resourcefully. Women cleared rubble with bare hands, sorting bricks for reuse in reconstruction efforts underway. Children played in bombed buildings, their games incorporating the ruins into imagined worlds created. Old men pushed carts loaded with scavenged wood for fuel since coal remained impossibly scarce. Everyone moved with the slow deliberation of those chronically undernourished and exhausted completely always. For generations, German cities had represented order, efficiency, and industrial might proudly displayed everywhere. Factories had produced goods that competed globally. Buildings rose tall and magnificent to inspire. Pride in craft, precision, and quality had defined German identity across many centuries before. Now that pride lay buried under the very rubble those skills had created, then destroyed. Rebuilding would require decades, perhaps generations, to restore what had been lost so completely. The prisoner thought about the food portions that had shocked him months earlier again. That abundance existed somewhere beyond this devastation, untouched and thriving despite war's destruction here. America had emerged stronger from the war, while Europe had bled itself nearly to death. The contrast between victor and vanquished had never been so stark or so total before. He wondered if recovery was possible, or if Europe would remain subordinate forever now. The train stopped at a processing center, where prisoners would be formally released finally. Allied military personnel checked documents, verified identities, and provided basic travel permits needed. Each man received a small amount of occupation currency and directions to local authorities. From here they would scatter to find whatever remained of homes and families left. The prisoner learned his town lay 30 kilometers away, a distance he would walk. For generations, returning soldiers had been met by welcoming crowds celebrating their homecoming joyfully. Now the prisoner walked alone along damaged roads, seeing no celebrations anywhere around him. Occasional people passed going the opposite direction, eyes down, faces drawn with exhaustion always. No one asked where he had been or why he now wore civilian clothes issued. Everyone carried their own burdens too heavy to bear interest in others' stories or pasts. The walk took most of a day, his weakened legs protesting the distance continuously. He passed through villages where houses stood empty, their inhabitants dead, fled, or displaced. Temporary signs indicated which buildings remained structurally sound enough to inhabit safely yet. Others bore warnings about unstable walls or unexploded ordnance still lurking within rubble everywhere. The whole landscape felt haunted by absence, by who should be here but wasn't anymore. He reached his town as twilight fell and almost didn't recognize the place initially. Whole neighborhoods had vanished, reduced to cleared lots where rubble had been sorted away. The church steeple, once the town's highest point, now stood broken halfway up completely. His street appeared largely intact, though houses showed damage from shrapnel and small arms fire. He walked slowly toward the number that had been home, uncertain what he would find. For generations, home had meant certainty, belonging, and the comfort of familiar places known. Children grew up in houses their grandparents had known, surrounded by continuity of space. The prisoner had carried a memory of home through all the war's chaos and displacement. Now he faced the reality that memory and current truth might no longer match perfectly. The door stood before him, paint peeling, a window covered with cardboard replacing glass broken. He knocked softly, almost hoping no one would answer rather than face what came next. Footsteps approached inside, slow and careful, the sound of someone cautious about unexpected visitors. The door opened slightly and his mother's face appeared, older, thinner, but alive still. Recognition came slowly, disbelief passing across her features before joy broke through, suddenly overwhelming. She pulled him inside with surprising strength, tears starting before words could form properly yet. The small apartment held his mother and younger brother, both having survived the fighting. His brother had been wounded slightly but recovered, spared the worst in final chaos. They had food for tomorrow, perhaps the day after, but nothing certain beyond that. His mother had been standing in a bread line when he knocked unexpectedly on door. Now that line would have to wait while they absorbed his impossible return home. For generations, families had shared what they had regardless of how little remained available. Tables had always somehow stretched to accommodate one more mouth needing to feed regularly. But now his mother looked at him with worry alongside joy in her eyes. One more person meant dividing already insufficient portions into even smaller shares for everyone. The prisoner understood immediately that his survival had brought both relief and burden home. He reached into his bag and pulled out items saved from his final days. A chocolate bar, somewhat melted but intact, from the ship's limited provisions issued previously. A small package of crackers, a bit of cheese wrapped in paper carefully preserved throughout. These treasures, negligible by camp standards, represented wealth here beyond easy calculation now. His mother's eyes filled with tears again at seeing such impossible abundance in hand. They ate the chocolate slowly, each piece divided further so flavor lasted longer for everyone. His brother, now 16, stared at the candy as if seeing something from another world. He could not remember the last time he had tasted real chocolate or anything sweet. The prisoner watched his family savor each bite and felt the guilt return stronger than before. He had eaten such things casually while they had starved here defending the crumbling nation. For generations, guilt had been a private matter between individual and conscience or God alone. But this guilt was collective, shared by an entire generation that had brought catastrophe down. They had believed the propaganda, followed the orders, participated in the terrible machine that ran. Now they lived among the ruins of their choices while occupied by victorious foreign powers. The prisoner saw this awareness in his brother's eyes, in his mother's careful words chosen. Night came and they sat in darkness to save the small allotment of electricity. Candles were precious and used only when absolutely necessary for essential tasks required then. They talked quietly, catching up on years compressed into careful summaries that omitted much. His mother described neighbors who had died, buildings destroyed, the gradual collapse of everything known. His brother spoke of the final weeks when children had been given weapons to fight. The prisoner listened without sharing much of his own experience during those same years. What could he say that would not make their suffering seem worse by comparison? That he had eaten well while they starved, slept warm while they froze in shelters, that his captivity had been gentler than their freedom in a nation destroying itself. Silence seemed more merciful than truth in this instance, so silence he mostly maintained. For generations, truth had been valued as a moral good to be pursued regardless. But war had taught him that truth could be cruel, even when factually accurate. Some truths serve no purpose except to wound those already injured beyond easy healing. He would carry the memory of American abundance alone, a private knowledge not to share. His family needed him to have suffered too, and so he let them believe that. Mourning brought the necessity of finding work or registering for occupation support somehow available. The American military government had established offices to process returning soldiers and displaced persons. Lines formed early, snaking around blocks as thousands sought help simultaneously from overwhelmed staff. The prisoner joined the queue, preparing for hours of waiting in cold March wind blowing. Around him, other men stood silently, eyes hollow with exhaustion and hunger and hopelessness complete. For generations, German efficiency and organization had been legendary across the world, famously recognized. Now chaos reigned as systems broke down under overwhelming demand and depleted resources combined together. Paperwork disappeared, records burned, officials fled or died, leaving gaps impossible to fill quickly. The occupation forces tried to impose order, but lacked personnel and understanding of local conditions. Everything moved slowly when it moved at all, through bureaucratic tangles and competing authorities present. The prisoner eventually reached a desk where a bored American clerk processed his information. Speaking limited German, the clerk asked questions, filled out forms in triplicate with carbons. The prisoner received ration cards, a temporary work permit, and directions to a labor office. The whole interaction took minutes but had required 6 hours of waiting to reach this point. He left with papers that might allow him to feed his family if supplies existed. The rations allocated were minimal, barely adequate to sustain life without providing real health. Bread, potatoes, some grain products, occasionally thin meat rations of uncertain origin and quality. It was less than American prisoners had received than German soldiers had eaten during war, yet it represented the best available to a defeated population living in occupied ruins now. The prisoner understood that his family would continue to be hungry, just not quite starving. For generations, meals had been social occasions gathering family around shared food and conversation. Now, meals meant carefully dividing insufficient amounts and eating quickly before hunger pangs returned. His mother performed mathematical miracles, stretching provisions through skill and long practice honed well. She made soup from scraps that would have been discarded before as beneath consideration completely. Every potato peel, every vegetable scrap, every bone found use in her desperate kitchen. The prisoner found work clearing rubble in a city reconstruction project organized by authorities. Manual labor paid little but provided small supplemental rations beyond the basic allotments given. He worked alongside other former soldiers, none speaking much about what they had experienced before. They lifted stones, sorted bricks, filled carts with debris to be hauled away slowly. The work was hard, but offered the dignity of purposeful activity toward building something again. Each day he thought about the contrast between his current labor and camp life. There, work had been optional, light, almost recreational in its lack of real pressure. Here, everything carried desperate weight as people struggled merely to survive each day. The rubble they cleared had been homes, shops, lives destroyed in minutes of bombing runs. Each stone represented someone's loss, and sometimes they found remnants of those lives still buried. For generations, cities had seemed permanent, solid, enduring beyond individual human lifetimes easily expected. Buildings stood for centuries, outlasting families who had built and occupied them through time. Now he saw how quickly everything could be reduced to dust and rubble completely destroyed. The impermanence of human creation became visceral truth through his hands moving stones daily. Nothing lasted if enough force was applied. This was war's lesson written in ruins. Months passed in this routine of work, hunger, and small improvements barely visible yet. His brother found work as well, though younger men faced disadvantage in competitive markets. Together they earned enough to supplement rations and occasionally acquire small black market items. Coffee substitutes, a bit of real sugar, once even butter purchased at ruinous prices. These tiny luxuries marked progress, however slight, towards something resembling normal life again. The American Marshall Plan began as a rumor, then a possibility, finally a reality unfolding. Aid shipments started arriving, food and materials to begin rebuilding Europe's shattered nations gradually. Even Germany, recently enemy, would receive assistance under this unprecedented program of reconstruction support. The prisoner watched supply trucks unload goods and marveled at the scale of generosity displayed. This was the abundance he had seen in captivity, now extended to defeated populations too. For generations, victory had meant extracting wealth from the defeated to enrich victorious nations. Reparations, tributes, seizure of resources. These were the expected patterns history had always shown. The Marshall Plan reversed this ancient logic, investing in recovery rather than extracting revenge. American self-interest played a role, needing stable trading partners and bulwarks against Soviet expansion. But the scale exceeded narrow calculation, reflecting some genuine belief in shared prosperity's possibility perhaps. The prisoner thought about the question his fellow prisoner had asked months before. "Are we supposed to share this for a week?" the man had said, seeing his tray. That question echoed now as American aid flowed into German hands that had recently held weapons. The same abundance that fed prisoners now fed their families still struggling in ruins here. Perhaps the answer had always been yes, humans were meant to share when some had plenty. Food distributions increased, bringing more adequate rations to the population gradually over time passing. Bread became more reliable, potatoes more plentiful. Occasionally meat appeared in distributions now too. People began to look less gaunt, children's faces filled out slightly, color returned to cheeks. The immediate crisis of starvation receded, replaced by the slower work of rebuilding everything destroyed. The prisoner watched his mother's face relax slightly as hunger's pressure eased incrementally forward. For generations, his family had known modest security through hard work and careful management practiced. War had stripped that security away, leaving only survival and constant fear of tomorrow's deprivation. Now, gradually, a new kind of security began to emerge from the ruins and reconstruction. It was built partly on American aid, partly on German labor and determination to recover. But it also reflected new economic arrangements being imposed by occupying powers' requirements now present. The prisoner learned English more seriously, recognizing the language as key to future opportunities. American businesses were establishing offices in Germany, needing workers who could communicate across cultures. The Occupation Administration hired Germans for various positions requiring bilingual skills and local knowledge. Those who mastered English found better positions with better pay than manual labor provided. He studied at night by candlelight, memorizing vocabulary and practicing pronunciation alone, patiently always. His improvement came slowly but steadily through consistent effort across many months of practice. The language opened not just practical opportunities but also conceptual windows into American thinking. English words for efficiency, productivity, and optimization carried assumptions about world and possibility together. The grammar itself seemed to reflect American directness, individualism, and future orientation consistently throughout structure. Learning the language meant absorbing some of the worldview embedded within its patterns deep inside. For generations, German intellectuals had valued philosophical depth, historical consciousness, and cultural sophistication always. They had looked at America as shallow, materialistic, and lacking true culture worth respecting. The prisoner had believed this, had felt superior despite his working-class background limiting access. Now he recognized these attitudes as defensive, protecting fragile pride amid declining relative power. American culture had different strengths, practical ones that had proven decisive when material force mattered. He began to see possibilities in this American way of thinking about problems and solutions. Scarcity was not fate, but challenge to be overcome through innovation and organization applied. Abundance could be created rather than just seized from others through conquest and extraction. These ideas contradicted everything his generation had been taught about resources being fundamentally limited. Yet here was the evidence. America had created plenty and now shared some of it. The prisoner's brother embraced these new ideas more easily than older generations could manage. Young people had less invested in old certainties that had proven catastrophically wrong already. He talked about learning skills that would matter in the new economy being built here: engineering, business, languages. These practical abilities would carry more value than traditional learning or craft. The prisoner recognized. His brother was right, but felt a pang of loss for what disappeared. For generations, craftsmanship had represented the highest achievement for working-class German families everywhere. Master tradesmen passed skills to apprentices through years of patient instruction and practice together. Pride in work well done had meaning beyond economic value, representing excellence and tradition maintained. Now efficiency and mass production were replacing these old guild traditions everywhere, rapidly spreading forward. The prisoner understood this change as necessary, but mourned the loss of something valuable regardless. Years passed in this way, work and study and gradual improvement accumulating incrementally forward always. The worst rubble was cleared, temporary structures became permanent, trees planted grew taller yearly. His mother aged but gained some peace as security returned to daily life, slowly but certainly. His brother completed training and found work with an American-German joint venture company established. The prisoner himself gained employment using his English skills for translation work needed regularly now. He never forgot that meal, his first in American captivity years before, now distant. The shock of those portions had represented a revelation about the world beyond Europe's bounds. That abundance had seemed almost obscene, while his family starved in a nation tearing itself apart. Now, similar abundance was beginning to appear in Germany's shops, at least in cities rebuilding. The prisoner understood this was possible only because of American aid and the systems being implemented. For generations, his people had believed in struggle as life's defining characteristic shaping human existence. Resources were limited, nations competed, only the strong survived while others fell to poverty. This worldview had justified aggression, militarism, and ultimately catastrophic war that destroyed everything built. The alternative vision, American in origin though not exclusive to them, suggested different possibilities entirely. Cooperation could create more than competition extracted. Abundance could replace scarcity as normal condition achieved. The prisoner thought about sharing, about that simple question asked in wonder and confusion. Families had always shared within themselves, even when doing so meant everyone went hungry together. Communities had shared during harvests, neighbors helping neighbors despite personal hardship or struggle present. But sharing between strangers, between nations, between former enemies, this seemed radical and new entirely. Yet here it was happening, imperfectly but real, changing the patterns history had followed. He walked through streets now partly rebuilt, shops beginning to stock goods from distant factories. Children played in parks cleared of rubble and replanted with grass and flowers growing steadily. Women pushed carriages with babies born into a world without active war surrounding them everywhere. The occupation was ending gradually, self-governance returning in limited but expanding forms over time. Germany would eventually be whole again, though the process would take decades to complete fully. For generations, his family had lived in this region, working its soil and factories faithfully. They had survived wars, plagues, famines, and now this greatest catastrophe of all experienced together. The prisoner wondered if his children, should he have them, would remember what this time taught. Would they understand that abundance required choosing cooperation over conflict between peoples and nations? Or would new generations forget, letting old patterns of thinking reassert themselves gradually over time? He could not predict the future, but knew the past had been irrevocably broken here. The old certainties were gone, the old powers diminished, the old ways proven insufficient completely. Something new was being built from the ruins, influenced by American ideas but shaped locally. Whether it would last beyond the current generation remained unknown, a question for time alone. But for now, there was enough food, enough work, enough hope to continue forward each day. The prisoner, no longer really a prisoner, no longer quite a soldier either, walked home. His mother would have soup ready, his brother would arrive from work later as usual. They would eat together around a small table in their small apartment as family together. The portions would be adequate if not generous, the result of work and rations combined. And somewhere in the distance, ships continued arriving with aid from that strange, abundant land. For generations to come, people would try to understand what had happened here fully. Why such destruction had been necessary. What lessons should be carried forward into tomorrow. But tonight, in this moment, the simple fact of having eaten sufficed as meaning enough. The prisoner was grateful for survival, grateful for family, grateful even for generous enemies perhaps. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and questions that had no easy answers waiting there. But tonight, the hunger had receded, and that alone felt like a kind of peace.